So here's an example of, remember that list of essential questions? You've already been asked to identify a couple essential questions. And we want to take a look at the process doc where it asks you to come up with a topic and a focus. So say I chose this for my essential question. How can colleges adapt to our changing world and changing student demographics and populations? What should colleges be prioritizing to better fulfill their educational purposes? So first of all, please note that some of these essential questions have multiple questions within them. You do not need to try to answer every single one of those questions. They're sort of just different ways of looking at the same concept. But this is very broad as well. So essentially, we're thinking about narrowing so that we have a topic and a focus. I think one type of changing student, like let's identify a particular type of demographic. One thing we're noticing is that, college used to be back in the day just for the elite, right? But college is becoming much more democratic. For example, we've gotten rid of the ACT requirement. You don't even have to have taken the ACT to get into UCM. So we have many more students from less privileged backgrounds coming to college. So that would be sort of a topic and a focus. And then, of course, I want to have an answer, right? So I'm going to say maybe colleges need to restructure general education courses to better suit changing demographics and populations. So that's where I'm getting closer to a topic and a focus. My topic is going to be changing gen eds. My focus is going to be for a more democratic population of students from different types of backgrounds. So I want to remind you on Classroom, and please note that your classroom might not look exactly the same as this because I use videos for multiple courses that share the same assignments. So you might have some dates different, you might have some things titled differently, but on your process doc, here we go. When you open that thing up, you should already have done the brainstorming over the essential questions, so you've identified a couple essential questions, and now you want to choose the essential question that you think you want to focus your paper on. It is possible, too, that you do a combo, so maybe a couple of them overlap in the thing that you want to talk about, and that's totally cool. Focus angle, I want to focus on students from less privileged backgrounds and how we should change gen eds. It doesn't have to be a sentence, sort of just key phrases that help me narrow my focus. Key points and important considerations. So for this, I want to say sort of, whatever helps you at this point, think about some key things that you want to say. So I might include here more students from less privileged backgrounds going to college. These students statistically, not always true, but statistically struggle more / drop out more, or sort of are pushed out more because they don't feel it's culturally relevant to them or whatever, right? So there's all kinds of statistics on this. I want to talk about how colleges should respond. Maybe I don't have answers to that quite yet, but I've been doing some research. So changing gen ed structures. I don't want to argue that we want to get rid of them completely. That's a little bit uncomplex, right? That doesn't really acknowledge the value of these classes, but maybe I want to argue that we need to change the structure of the gen ed program a little bit. And then here you're going to have a tentative thesis. So how do we build that thesis? We do need to make a claim. Every thesis makes a statement that is a claim that's debatable, or in this case sort of discussable, right? So you probably will have a should or a need to phrase in your thesis, a should or a need to phrase. So think about what you want to happen. Do you want more people to be aware of it? Do you think our values should be different? Do you want things like actual policies to change? Not every thesis will have a should or a need to, but I'm going to sort of start there as an example of how to build the thesis. So I'm going to say because of increasing numbers of college students coming from less privileged backgrounds. And this phrase is a little bit clunky for now. I'm not sure that's exactly how I want to word that, but this is a draft. And I'm hoping that as I read more about this, I'll get some phrases in my own vocabulary that can help me better articulate what I'm talking about here. So because it's a draft, I'm going to leave it clunky. I'm not going to focus on it too much or be too rough on myself. It's a tentative thesis. It just helps me establish what my main position is. Public universities should, or I could say need to, reconsider their gen ed structure. Now, in a thesis, I don't want to abbreviate into gen ed. I want to say general education, right? I want to say the actual term. This is also a little vague. Should reconsider in what way? Well, at this point, I'm not really sure what I want to say yet there. I haven't read a lot of articles about this yet from the bank. So I'm going to leave it here knowing that it's a little bit vague. And I'll be pointing out on your thesis statements, oh, this is a little bit vague. As you continue to read articles, you might want to be a little more specific here. But for now, that gives me a topic and a focus, okay? So a couple reminders of what your thesis should do and what your thesis should look like. It's going to explain your position or your perspective. It needs to have significance to the audience, so a sense of why it matters. So you could say something like, this significant statement often says, to ensure everybody has the right to an education, because that has meaning to people, right? That explains why this is so important. So that sense of significance should be there. It should be arguable and supportable, or like debatable, right? There should be multiple perspectives that people would have on this, not just a fact. So I wouldn't want to say just more students from different backgrounds are going to college. That's not something anybody can disagree with. It's just true. It should make a strong, interesting, and specific claim, and that specific is important. I'm specifically focusing on students from lower socioeconomic status types of backgrounds, so that makes it specific. I'm also specifically saying gen ed structures need to change, not just college needs to change, because that's super broad. It also needs to acknowledge the complexity of the issue, so you don't want something that seems sort of overly one-sided. And again, in your drafts, I can help you determine if this is what's happening. So, a couple other tips. Make sure we're being specific, narrow enough for the required length of paper. This is only a 4-page paper. So something like this example, it's called negative example, meaning it's not a good example of a thesis. It's an example of a thesis that isn't specific enough. Online education has many benefits over traditional classroom education. Many benefits is huge. We want to focus on a specific type of benefit. So for the paper I'm working on, the thesis I'm working on, if I said student demographics are changing and colleges need to respond, that's huge, right? It needs to be much more specific. Also contain only one main idea. We don't want a thesis that lists many different ideas. Like this, classroom education is better than online education for traditional students and non-traditional students because it's more challenging, more personalized, and more social. A 4-page paper could be just about how classroom education is better for traditional students because it's more social. And that's a thesis that has that sense of control we want and specificity. And we want to avoid ambiguous and abstract terms whenever possible. So something like this, online education offers democracy, equity, and freedom. So that's a cool starting place. Online education is more democratic. Maybe, right? We don't need all those big words in there, all those abstract words in there, but it's more democratic. But then maybe adding a because and adding something a little more concrete because it offers blank, something that readers can latch on to more. We don't want a thesis that's too up in the clouds because then the paper is less likely to be structured and controlled. So here's some examples of how we go about doing this. First of all, think of your essential question or that list of questions that I provided in this presentation, and then answer that question. Write your answer as a statement, right? It's going to have your position, your suggestion, or your insight. And then add your reasoning, which is your why. And so you might have a because in there. or add a qualifier. So under what circumstances, for whom, when, to what extent. You might also consider adding an although phrase that adds the other perspective. So this is how you acknowledge complexity. So you might say, although general education courses are not popular amongst students, they should be maintained because blank. And that just acknowledges that you understand the other side, that you know that exists, that even that you think they have some good points, right? So here's an example thesis that what you see underlined is like the perspective or the position I'm taking, but I have these qualifiers that make it a little more complex. Because of public high schools' recent push to send every student to college, and rhetoric suggesting the purpose of college is to gain a career, freshmen's perception of college has become too limited toward careerism. So, that's an example thesis that has that because phrase, which is the why, and the perspective in it. I also want to remind you of the resource docs that are available, including how to write a synthesis essay, the resource doc. It has some thesis statement templates on it. I've added one here on the bottom as well, depending on the type of paper that you think you're going to write. So you could pause and take a look at this, sort of fill in the blank, and then make it your own. And here's a great place to pause too, because this slide includes some examples of pretty successful student thesis statements from pretty successful student papers. So if you take a look at these, you can see the position in them. Some of them have because phrases with the why. Some of them have although phrases where they're acknowledging the other perspective. The first one is a 2-sentence thesis statement where they identify a problem and then sort of a solution. I also want you to notice how each of these is very specific in its focus. So they've narrowed to focus on a particular demographic, a particular issue within those larger questions. So that's how to approach the topic, thesis, and focus. And the next video will talk to you about how to build an outline for this paper.